The sound of boots against the cold pavement echoed in the darkened alley. The rhythmic march of a man running out of time. The city of New York, still scarred from the war, stood in the distance, its lights flickering like a fading hope. It was the spring of 1946, but for those who had lived through the war, the nightmare felt as fresh as ever. The war may have ended, but for some, the true battle had just begun. John Mitchell, a 45-year-old mechanic with rough hands and an unassuming demeanor, had lived a life of quiet routine. He had seen the horrors of the war firsthand, losing friends, losing parts of himself. He was a man who had fought for his country, who had come back and tried to rebuild a shattered world. His days were spent working on engines, fixing what was broken, and rebuilding things that mattered. Or so he thought. He had always been a man of simple needs, finding comfort in routine and a few quiet moments. He had survived the war, and that, he believed, was enough. Yet on this night, nothing would be the same. John's evening had begun like any other, a simple dinner with his wife, Emily, in their small apartment. The weather was crisp, the air carrying a chill that reminded John of the long winters spent in the trenches. But the tranquility of their home was shattered when there was a knock at the door, faint but deliberate. At first, John had hesitated. It was already late, and after the war, visitors were rare. He wiped his hands on a rag and moved toward the door. Curiosity piqued. When he opened it, he found himself staring at a man who could have easily been a ghost. A young German soldier, no older than his own son, standing in the doorway. His uniform was ragged, stained with dirt, and his face was gaunt, as though he had not eaten in days. His eyes, wide and fearful, locked onto John's with an unspoken plea for help. The man said nothing at first. His chest heaved, and his breath came in shallow gasps. His hands shook visibly as he held a small piece of paper. A crumpled letter, a plea for mercy. John froze. His heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. This was the enemy, the very soldiers who had brought so much destruction to the world, to his friends, to his country. The thought of helping him, of bringing this man into his home, was unthinkable. Yet there was something about the soldier's eyes, something human that spoke louder than the uniform he wore. In that moment, John's breath hitched, and he found himself at a crossroads. The soldier, noticing John's hesitation, spoke in broken English, his voice barely audible. "Please, they are looking for me. I can't go back." His eyes pleaded with John, silently begging for a chance. "I'm not like them. I don't belong with them." John's mind raced, conflicting emotions clashing violently inside him. The memories of battle, of the lives lost, the faces of his fallen comrades flashed before his eyes. The war had been brutal, unforgiving. Yet this was not a soldier of the Third Reich standing before him. This was a man, a young boy, just like him, caught in a storm of forces far beyond his control. "Why should I help you?" John's voice was steady, but inside his chest tightened. He didn't want to know the answer. He didn't want to hear any justification that would make him question his own values. I can't go back to them," the soldier whispered again. "They'll kill me. I don't want to fight anymore." John could feel his heart sinking, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He glanced behind the soldier to the empty street, the shadows stretching long in the dim light. If anyone saw, if anyone knew, his life would be ruined. His wife, his family, everything was at risk. The soldier could be a liar, a trap door leading straight into a nightmare. But the fear in the young man's eyes, the desperation in his voice, made John question everything he had ever known. He took a step back, the decision weighing heavily on his chest. "Come in," he said, barely above a whisper, his voice thick with uncertainty. The soldier's eyes widened in disbelief. His shoulders sagged with relief, but it was a fleeting moment, a brief glimpse of hope before the harsh reality set in. John shut the door softly behind him and motioned toward the back of the apartment. He had no plan, no idea what he was doing. His instinct had taken over. The soldier walked in, moving cautiously, as though he were stepping into a world that didn't belong to him, a world he didn't understand. Emily, his wife, was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands still wrapped around a cup of tea. She had heard the door, had seen the figure in the doorway. Her eyes met John's, and for a moment, neither spoke. She had known something was off. John's face had turned pale, his jaw tight with an unspoken decision. "What is this?" Emily asked softly, her voice breaking the silence like a shot in the dark. "He needs our help," John replied, his words heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. The soldier, standing awkwardly near the door, shifted nervously. His eyes darted between John and Emily, unsure of what came next, of what this moment would bring. Emily looked at John, then back at the soldier. Her expression was unreadable. She had never imagined this, never prepared for this moment. But her love for John, the man who had stood by her through everything, was stronger than the fear that threatened to engulf her. She nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "Sit," she said, her voice quiet, but firm. She gestured to the chair across from her. The soldier hesitated, as if waiting for some sign that he wasn't making a terrible mistake. But as he sat down, the room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with the weight of the decision they had all just made. John didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how long they could keep him hidden, or what it would cost them. But he had made a choice, and the consequences of that choice were already beginning to take root. The war had ended, but their personal battle was just beginning. The door had been opened, and there was no turning back now. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence stretching like an eternity. Each of them knew that their lives had changed forever. What they didn't know was how far this decision would take them, how deep the consequences would cut into their lives. But they would soon find out. The days after the soldiers' arrival passed in a blur, each one fading into the next, marked only by the weight of the decision John Mitchell had made. The walls of their small apartment felt closer, the air heavier. There was no more space to breathe freely, not for John, not for Emily, and certainly not for the soldier whose name was Karl Weber. Karl had been silent for the first few days, a shadow in their home, moving as though he were afraid of disturbing the peace. His presence was like a storm brewing on the horizon, present, inevitable, but impossible to fully grasp. Emily could feel it every time she passed him in the kitchen, every time their eyes met, even in the moments of silence when John would leave for work, leaving her alone with the soldier. The man who had fought for the very army that had taken everything from them was now sitting in their living room, eating their food, sharing their space. At first, she hadn't known how to look at him. Was he a victim of the war, or was he complicit in its horrors? Could she truly believe his story? Or was he just another enemy in disguise, hiding his true nature behind the mask of fear and helplessness? She had so many questions, but none she dared to ask. The fear was palpable, thickening with each passing hour. John, on the other hand, seemed resolute, perhaps too resolute. He had made his choice, and it was clear that he had no intention of turning back. Each time Emily voiced her doubts, each time the unease threatened to swallow her, John would remind her that they had made a promise to this man, to Karl, and that was something they would honor. But Emily wasn't sure she could, and with every passing day, she could feel the quiet tension building between them. Karl, for his part, had tried to assimilate into their life, but there was an unmistakable distance between him and his hosts. He sat at the kitchen table, eating in silence, always looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. His eyes, once filled with hope and fear, were now dull, resigned. It was as though the weight of his past, of the war he had been part of, was too much to bear, and he was now only a shell of the young man who had once worn a uniform with pride. John had tried to speak to him, tried to understand what had driven him to fight in that war. But Karl's responses were always vague. He never offered much beyond the basics. That he had been drafted, that he had been a soldier like any other, doing what he was told. He had never believed in the ideology, he claimed, and now he simply wanted to live. But the doubts that lingered in Emily's mind were never fully erased. One evening, as they sat together at the table, a knock echoed through the apartment, causing the hairs on the back of Emily's neck to stand on end. She looked at John, her eyes wide with panic. John, however, remained calm, perhaps too calm, as he rose from his seat and walked toward the door. The man standing on the other side was not a government official, but someone just as dangerous, someone they hadn't expected. "Evening, John," said the man, a grizzled figure in his early 40s, wearing a thick coat that shielded him from the cold. He had a cigarette dangling from his lips and a weathered expression that spoke of years spent in the trenches, both literal and metaphorical. "I didn't think I'd catch you at home." "Henry," John said, his voice strained, as he stepped back to let his old war buddy into the apartment. "What are you doing here?" Henry, an old friend from John's days in the army, had been part of a unit that had served in North Africa and later in Europe. John had trusted him with his life more times than he cared to count. But now, standing in the doorway, Henry's eyes flicked to Karl and then back to John, with a knowing look. "I was in the neighborhood," Henry said, his tone casual, but there was an edge to it. "Thought I'd drop by, see how you're doing. You know, it's been a while." Emily felt a chill run through her as she looked at the man standing in the middle of their home. Something in Henry's demeanor felt off. The way his eyes lingered on Karl, the way he seemed to study the room like he was looking for something. She had never met him, but she could sense that his presence was more than just a friendly visit. "Sit down, Henry," John said, motioning to the chair at the table. But even as he spoke, there was a tension in his voice that betrayed his calm exterior. Henry took a seat, but his gaze never left Karl. "And who's this?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "New friend, John?" Karl shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Emily could see it now, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, the way his shoulders were hunched as though he were bracing for something. But whatever he feared, it wasn't just the war. It was something deeper, something much more personal. "This is Karl," John said, his voice steady, though the words felt like they were being dragged from him. "He's, staying with us." Henry raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half-smile. "I see," he said. "A German soldier, huh? Interesting." He leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "You know, John, I've heard some things about what's been going on. People don't like seeing things like this, you know?" Emily's heart skipped a beat as she felt the weight of Henry's words settle over the room. She could sense that something was changing, that the walls around them were closing in. She could feel it. This was no ordinary visit. Henry was not here just to catch up. He knew something, and that something was about to come to a head. John cleared his throat, trying to remain composed. "What do you mean, Henry?" Henry leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just saying that people are asking questions. There's been talk, not just here, but around the neighborhood. People are suspicious, John. They're starting to notice things." The room grew colder, the air thick with unspoken truths. Emily's pulse quickened. She could feel the danger, like a dark cloud looming just above them. Henry's visit wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning, and it was a warning that they couldn't ignore. Henry stood up abruptly, as though he had seen enough. "Well, I'll leave you to it then," he said, his voice almost too casual. "Just thought I'd remind you, John. People don't forget, and neither do I." He turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, he paused and glanced back at Karl one last time. "Stay safe," he said, his voice carrying a weight of something much darker than a mere farewell. As the door clicked shut behind him, the silence in the apartment became suffocating. John and Emily stood frozen, both of them feeling the same icy chill that had settled in their hearts. Emily turned to John, her voice shaking. "What does he know?" John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Karl, whose face was pale, his eyes filled with dread. For the first time, John understood. This was no longer just about helping a man in need. It was about survival. And the consequences of their actions were beginning to ripple outward, threatening to destroy everything they had worked to protect. Something was coming, and they couldn't escape it. The world outside the apartment had never felt so dangerous. The whispers on the street, the eyes that followed John and Emily whenever they left the building, and the growing sense of unease around Karl. Everything was building towards something inevitable. The days following Henry's visit passed like a waking nightmare. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching them, waiting for the wrong move. John had tried to dismiss her fears, assuring her that they were fine, that Henry had no real power, but Emily wasn't convinced. Something had changed. Henry's words lingered in the air, his casual remarks now an ominous warning that gnawed at her insides. Karl, too, had become more withdrawn, his fear mounting with each passing day. It was clear that the weight of their decision was starting to break him down. He was no longer the young man who had begged for mercy at their door. He had become a shadow of himself, haunted by the past and the ever-present fear of being found. And then, it happened. It was a cold evening, the kind of evening that seemed to stretch out into infinity. The air was thick with the promise of something terrible. John had just returned from work, his boots clicking against the floor as he entered the apartment. Emily was at the window, staring out at the street below, her expression blank. Karl was sitting at the table, his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly. "Emily?" John's voice was low, carrying a weight of something he wasn't saying. "We need to talk." She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes haunted. "I know," she whispered, almost too softly for him to hear. "I feel it too." John moved toward her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I spoke to Henry today." Emily's heart stopped. "What did he say?" "He knows more than he let on," John said, his voice tight. "He's part of something bigger than just himself. There are people watching us, Emily. They know Karl's here." Emily felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The ground had been slipping from under them for days, and now it was crumbling away. "What do we do? We can't let them find him." John's jaw clenched. He had no answers. He had only the weight of a decision that had grown too heavy for him to bear alone. The quiet had been shattered, and now the storm was coming. Just then, a sharp knock at the door echoed through the apartment. The sound was so abrupt, so sudden, that it felt like a death sentence. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she looked at John. This was it. The moment they had feared. The moment they couldn't escape. John stepped forward, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Stay back," he said to Emily and Karl, his voice steady but taut with fear. "I'll handle it." But he knew, even as he spoke, that he wasn't in control anymore. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't something he could face alone. With a deep breath, John turned the knob and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was not just one man, but two. One was Henry, his face more hardened than before, his eyes sharp with intent. The other man was unfamiliar, a stern-looking man in a dark uniform, the kind of uniform that sent a chill crawling up John's spine. "We need to talk," Henry said, his voice far less friendly than it had been before. John's heart pounded in his chest. The man in the uniform stepped forward, his gaze scanning the room. Emily stood behind John, her eyes wide with panic, while Karl, who had been silently watching from the corner, began to shrink back into the shadows. Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. "You've made a mistake, John," he said, his tone cold. "This man you're hiding, he's not who you think he is. You're playing with fire." John's mind spun. "What do you mean? He's just a soldier who wants to survive. He's not one of them anymore." Henry's expression darkened. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This isn't just about survival anymore. There are people in power who need Karl, and they'll do whatever it takes to get him back." John's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. Henry wasn't just an old war buddy. He was part of something bigger, something far more dangerous. And Karl wasn't just a frightened young man. He was a pawn in a much larger game. The man in the uniform stepped closer. "You have two choices," he said, his voice like steel. "You can hand him over to us, or you can face the consequences. You're harboring a war criminal, John Mitchell. Do you understand the gravity of that?" The words hit John like a physical blow. His mind raced. The promise he had made to protect Karl, the decision that had seemed so simple in the moment, now felt like a death sentence. If he handed Karl over, if he betrayed the man he had sworn to protect, he would lose everything. His humanity, his integrity, and the respect of the people he loved. But if he didn't, Karl's trembling form, hidden in the corner, was now fully visible to the men in front of him. His eyes were wide, his breath shallow. He knew what was at stake, but he also knew what would happen to him if he was handed over. The fear in his eyes was palpable. He would die if he went back to them. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. "John, please, we can't give him up. We made a promise." But the man in the uniform wasn't listening. Time's running out. You have 5 minutes to make your decision. The seconds stretched, each one like an eternity. John's mind was a battlefield. The man in front of him was right. They were hiding a war criminal. They were harboring someone who had been part of the machine that had destroyed countless lives. But Karl was a human being. A scared, broken human being who wanted nothing more than to live. John's gaze flickered to Karl, whose face was now pale, his eyes wide with terror. And then to Emily, whose silent plea was clear in her eyes. She didn't want to lose everything. She didn't want to be forced into a choice like this, but the choice had been made for him. "I won't hand him over," John said, his voice firm, though his hands trembled. "He's not going back to them." For the briefest of moments, the world stood still. The silence in the room was deafening. And then, without another word, the man in the uniform reached into his coat, pulling out a set of handcuffs. "Then you've sealed your fate," he said. Everything happened in an instant. The man lunged forward, grabbing Karl by the arm, but before he could pull him toward the door, John reacted. He shoved the man back, sending him crashing against the wall. Emily screamed as chaos erupted in the apartment. Henry moved to grab John, but the old soldier was too quick, too desperate. "Get him out of here!" John shouted at Emily. "Go, now!" Emily hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but John's voice was a command she couldn't ignore. "Go, Emily!" he shouted again. She grabbed Karl's arm, pulling him toward the back door. As she fled, she glanced back one last time, meeting John's eyes. The look in her gaze was filled with love, fear, and sorrow. John stood frozen in the doorway, facing down the two men. They had come for Karl, and they were going to take him, but not without a fight. The tension in the room reached its peak, and John knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The fight for survival had just begun. The air in the apartment was thick with tension, heavy with the scent of sweat and fear. Time seemed to slow down, each second a fragile thread between life and death, between safety and destruction. John Mitchell stood in the doorway, facing the man in the uniform, and Henry, his old war buddy who had betrayed him, his family, his beliefs. But John wasn't thinking about Henry anymore. His mind was focused on one thing: Karl. Behind him, Emily had already pulled Karl toward the back door. John could hear the panicked footsteps of his wife, the sound of her breath coming in sharp gasps, and he knew that in mere moments, everything would change. If Karl made it out of that door, if they could escape into the night, then maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. But if not, "Get away from him!" John shouted, his voice raw, desperate, as he shoved the man in the uniform back once again. The man stumbled, his balance lost for a moment, and John saw his opportunity. He lunged forward, his fist connecting with the soldier's face. The blow was instinctive, fueled by the same desperation that had carried him through the war. The will to survive, the will to protect. The soldier reeled back, blood streaming from his nose, but he didn't fall. He recovered quickly, grabbing at John's collar, yanking him toward him with brutal force. "Fool!" the soldier spat, his grip tightening. "You can't stop this. You're just delaying the inevitable." John's heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But his mind was clear. He had made his choice. There was no going back now. He had to protect Karl. He had to protect his family, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Through the chaos, John heard Emily's voice, faint but desperate. "John, go! We have to go now." He forced his eyes away from the soldier and saw Emily standing in the hallway, pulling Karl along, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. But she was holding strong, holding on to Karl, refusing to let him go. And in that moment, John knew what he had to do. He twisted out of the soldier's grip, breaking free with a force he didn't know he had. Without a second thought, he charged toward Emily and Karl, pushing past the door and into the narrow alleyway behind their building. "Emily, move!" John shouted, his voice hoarse. "Run!" They didn't hesitate. Emily, her face streaked with tears, grabbed Karl's hand and ran as fast as she could. The alleyway was dark, the shadows closing in around them like a trap. Every step they took felt like an eternity. But John was right behind them, his chest heaving, his breath sharp as the night air. Then behind them, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. John turned to glance back, and in that fleeting moment, he saw the soldier and Henry emerging from the door. The soldier wiping blood from his face, fury burning in his eyes. "Get them!" the soldier barked, his voice carrying through the night. "Don't let them escape." "Emily, faster!" John shouted, pushing forward with all his strength. But the alley seemed to stretch endlessly before them. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Karl's life depended on it. Ahead, they saw the faint glow of a streetlight at the end of the alley, a sign of safety, of freedom. But before they could reach it, a figure appeared from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Henry. His face was a mask of regret, but there was something else in his eyes. A coldness, a hardness that John hadn't seen before. "Stop!" Henry called, holding up his hand. "You don't have to do this, John. It doesn't have to be like this." John skidded to a halt, his breath ragged. He looked at Henry, the man he had once trusted with his life, and for the first time, he saw the truth. Henry wasn't just a bystander in this. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of the system, part of the force that was closing in on them, and he had made his choice long ago. "Move, Henry," John said, his voice low but firm. "You're not stopping us." Henry hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Karl, who was standing behind Emily, his eyes wide with fear. For a brief moment, John saw something in Henry's eyes, a flicker of doubt, of regret. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold determination. "I can't let you do this," Henry said, his voice steady, but John could hear the strain in it. "I'm not the enemy, John. I'm just trying to survive, just like you." "No," John said, his voice sharp with the certainty of his decision. "You made your choice the moment you walked through that door. You're with them, Henry. You always have been." Henry's hand twitched toward his gun, but before he could draw it, John made a move. A split-second decision, driven by the instinct to protect. He lunged forward, pushing Henry to the side, his shoulder colliding with the other man's chest. For a moment, Henry lost his balance, stumbling backward into the alley wall. "Go!" John shouted, pushing Emily and Karl forward, away from Henry, away from the fight. They didn't have much time. The soldiers would be on them any second. But just as they reached the end of the alley, the sound of running footsteps grew louder behind them. The soldier was closing in, his voice shouting orders. "Don't let them get away!" John turned to face the approaching threat, his heart pounding. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. He had made it this far, but the price of their escape would be high. And John knew, deep down, that he couldn't outrun the consequences forever. He looked at Emily and Karl one last time, his heart breaking for what he knew he had to do. "Go!" he shouted, his voice fierce but tinged with sorrow. "Take him and go!" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, clutching Karl's hand tightly. She didn't look back as she pulled him down the street toward the safety of the night. John turned to face the soldiers, his breath ragged, his fists clenched at his sides. "You want him?" John said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "You'll have to go through me first." The soldier advanced on him, his gun raised, but John didn't flinch. He knew this moment was coming. He had known it from the moment he decided to protect Karl, and now it was time to pay the price. But just as the soldier raised his weapon, John heard a sharp cry from behind him. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't Karl. It was Henry. "Stop!" Henry shouted, his voice desperate. "I can't let this happen." Before John could fully understand, Henry was already moving, throwing himself between John and the soldier, his hands raised, pleading for them to stop. "You don't have to die for this," Henry said, his voice trembling. "You don't have to die for him." John's heart caught in his throat. The decision had shifted. The man who had once been the enemy was now the one willing to make the sacrifice. The moment was everything. And in the quiet before the storm, John knew that everything had changed. Henry was willing to lay down his life. But the question remained, would John survive this choice? Would he live long enough to make sure Karl and Emily got away? As the gunfire rang out, John didn't know if he would ever get that answer. But one thing was certain. The battle was far from over. The world seemed to move in slow motion after the gunfire rang out, each second hanging like a fragile thread in the wind, caught between life and death. For John Mitchell, time had stopped. His body had frozen, his breath caught in his throat as the sound of Henry's final cry echoed in the alleyway. The soldier, still standing with the gun in his hand, looked stunned for a moment, his expression one of confusion and hesitation. Henry, the man who had once been his ally, was now lying on the cold ground, his body trembling as the blood pooled around him. But in that moment, Henry had given John something more than a chance. He had given him a purpose. "Henry!" John shouted, stumbling toward the fallen man, his voice breaking with disbelief. "Why?" Henry's eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest moment, he seemed to recognize John. The sadness in his eyes was palpable. He had made his choice. The man who had once been the enemy had now given up his life for a cause larger than himself. I couldn't let you do it alone, John," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "I couldn't be the one to let you sacrifice everything for nothing." John knelt beside him, his heart heavy with regret and guilt. He had never wanted this. Not for himself, not for his family, and certainly not for Henry. But now it was too late. The choices had been made, and they were irreversible. The soldier with the gun stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His orders had been clear: capture Karl, bring him back at all costs. But now, with Henry's sacrifice hanging in the air like an unspoken truth, he seemed lost, torn between duty and the unexpected humanity that had just emerged before him. John didn't give him the chance to hesitate. He stood, pulling Henry's body gently into his arms. "You won't take him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't take anyone else." With a final glance toward the soldier, John turned and ran. His legs felt heavy, his body aching with the weight of everything that had happened. Emily and Karl were out there somewhere, and he needed to get to them. He needed to make sure they were safe, even if it meant never seeing them again. The alley stretched out before him, the lights of the city blurring in his peripheral vision as he pushed his body past its limits. The weight of Henry's sacrifice sat heavy on his chest, but it was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He could never forget what Henry had done for him, but he couldn't afford to look back. In the distance, he saw Emily and Karl, huddled together under the dim streetlight. Their faces were a mix of fear and relief, a quiet recognition that their journey was far from over. They were alive, and that was all that mattered now. "John!" Emily cried, her voice cracking as she ran toward him. She reached him in seconds, her arms wrapping around him as she held him close. "We have to go. We have to leave." John nodded, his breath ragged, his heart breaking at the sight of the woman he loved. But as he looked at her, he knew that their fight wasn't over. They had made it this far, but they were still in danger. The world was still out there, waiting for them to slip up, to make a mistake, and the weight of Henry's sacrifice still hung over him like a shadow. "I know," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll get away, Emily. We'll get through this." Karl stood at a distance, watching the exchange between them with wide eyes. He had seen too much in his short life. He had fought for a cause that had destroyed everything, and now, as he stood in the dim light of the street, he had nothing left. No country, no family, no future. But he had something that mattered more than anything else: a second chance. John turned to him, his hand on Emily's shoulder. "Come on," he said, his voice steady. "We're not done yet. We still have time." The three of them began to walk away, the city behind them fading into the distance. The streets seemed quieter now, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. But as they walked, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. Henry was gone, and with him, a part of John's soul. Days turned into weeks, and the three of them lived on the run. They moved from one place to another, always in fear of being found, always looking over their shoulders. John couldn't help but replay the moments in the alley. The gunshot, Henry's last words, and the weight of the choice he had made. But despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, they had made it. They had survived. And in that survival, there was a strange sense of redemption. Not for what they had done, but for the choices they had made to protect each other, to fight for something greater than themselves. One evening, as they sat together in a small, dimly lit room, Emily turned to John, her eyes filled with an unspoken question. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked softly. "All of this? Everything we've lost?" John looked at her, his eyes tired, his face weathered by the journey. But there was something in his gaze, something that told her he understood. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know if it was worth it, but I do know that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something." Emily nodded, her gaze softening as she leaned against him. "We did what we had to do, and we're still here." Karl sat quietly by the window, staring out at the darkening world beyond. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He had been saved. He had been given a chance. But now he had to decide what to do with that chance. "I'll never be the same," he said quietly, his voice filled with both regret and resolve. "But I want to try. I want to make things right." John looked at him, his heart swelling with something that could almost be called hope. "We all have that chance," and he said, "and as long as we stick together, we'll make it through, one step at a time." The room fell into a quiet, contemplative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But in that silence there was understanding. The road ahead would be difficult, the cost of their survival high. But as long as they remained true to each other, there was a chance for redemption, a chance for healing, and that was all they could ask for.